Every single day, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing produces approximately $26 million bills. That's roughly $696 million worth of currency, created out of thin air every 24 hours. But here's what doesn't make sense. If the US government can literally print money whenever it wants, why does it owe $36 trillion? Why do we pay taxes, and why, in 1933, did the US government make it illegal for you to own the very thing it prints? The answer to these questions reveals something far stranger than you might expect. Because the way dollars are actually made, both the physical bills in your wallet and the digital numbers in your bank account involves a 111-year-old building in Washington, D.C., a private corporation you've probably never heard of, and a system so counterintuitive that when you understand it, you'll question everything you thought you knew about money itself. Stay with me, because what you're about to learn isn't taught in schools. And honestly, there's probably a reason for that. Let's start with what most people think they know. You probably imagine the US government sitting in some vault, printing dollar bills and minting coins, right? The president signs a budget, the treasury fires out the printing presses, and boom, money appears. Simple, except that's not how it works, not even close. The physical dollar bills, the ones you can hold in your hand, are produced at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. It's a fortress-like building that's been operating since 1914, with facilities in Washington, D.C. and Fort Worth, Texas. They employ about 2,000 people working in shifts around the clock. And yes, the smell is apparently unforgettable, a mixture of ink, cotton, and linen that creates what workers call the smell of money. But here's the first twist. The Bureau doesn't decide how much money to print. That decision comes from the Federal Reserve. You know, the Fed, and here's where things get weird. The Federal Reserve isn't actually part of the US government. It's technically a private institution. Created in 1913 after a secret meeting on Jekyll Island, Georgia, where the wealthiest bankers in America gathered to design the very system that would control the nation's money supply. I'm not making this up, this actually happened. Millionaires literally sneaked onto an island using fake names to redesign American finance. And somehow, we just let that happen, but we'll come back to that. First, you need to understand what actually happens inside that fortress in Washington. The creation of a physical dollar bill is actually an engineering marvel that most people never think about. It starts with paper. Except it's not really paper, it's 75% cotton and 25% linen, the same stuff they make high-end bed sheets from. Which means dollar bills are technically fabric. You're essentially carrying tiny blankets in your wallet. You're welcome for ruining that for you. This special material is produced by Crane & Co., a company in Massachusetts that's been making currency paper since 1879. They're the only company in America authorized to do it, and their formula is classified. The paper includes red and blue security fibers that you can actually see if you look closely. Those tiny threads are end printed on. They're embedded in the fabric itself. The paper arrives at the Bureau in massive rolls, each one weighing about 10,000 pounds. From there, the dollar bill goes through a process that takes roughly 3 weeks and involves multiple printing stages. Stage 1. The offset printing. The back of the bill is printed first using a technique called offset lithography. This creates that familiar green background, and yes, there's a reason it's green. In the 1860s, the government needed an ink color that was difficult to photograph to prevent counterfeiting, and green was readily available in large quantities. So the most powerful currency in human history is green because it was convenient. Sometimes history is just that mundane. Stage 2. The intaglio printing. This is where it gets serious. The front of the bill is printed using engraved steel plates that are hand-carved by master engravers. These artists spend years learning to create the microscopically detailed portraits and designs. A single portrait can take 6 months to complete. The plates are pressed into the paper with 20 tons of pressure, creating raised ink you can actually feel. Run your finger over George Washington's collar. That texture is intentional. It as one of the many anti-counterfeiting measures that make US dollars some of the hardest currency to fake. Stage 3. The serial numbers. Each bill gets its own unique serial number, printed in a final pass. These numbers follow a specific formula that tracks when and where each bill was printed. The Bureau produces about 38 million notes per day, which means every second, they're assigning unique identifiers to about 440 bills. Stage 4. Inspection and destruction. Here is the part that hurts to think about. Automated systems inspect every single bill, and about 10% fail quality control. Those bills are shredded on the spot. Roughly 5,000 tons of money is destroyed every single year due to printing defects. Let that sink in. Literal tons of legal currency pulverized because the ink smudged. After inspection, the bills are cut, stacked into bricks of 4,000 notes, shrink-wrapped, and shipped to Federal Reserve banks across the country. From there, they're distributed to regular banks, and eventually, they end up in your wallet. The entire process costs about 7.5 cents per bill, whether it's a $1 bill or a $100 bill. Which raises an interesting question. If a $100 bill only costs 7.5 cents to make, why is it worth $100? And that question brings us to the real mystery. Because here's the thing that breaks most people's brains. Only about 11% of all US dollars actually exist as physical cash. Let me say that again, only 11% of dollars are physical. The other 89%, they're digital. Just numbers in computer systems, and they're not created by printing presses. They're created by banks out of thin air, through a process so bizarre that even economics professors struggle to explain it without sounding like conspiracy theorists. It's called fractional reserve banking, and it works like this. When you deposit $1,000 in your checking account, you think that money is sitting in the bank, right? Wrong. The bank is only required to keep about 10% of its $100 in this case. The other $900? The bank loans it out to someone else. But here's the insane part. When someone else borrows that $900, it doesn't disappear from your account. You still see $1,000 when you check your balance. And the person who borrowed $900 also sees $900 in their account. So your original $1,000 just became $1,900. The bank literally created $900 that didn't exist before. Poof, magic money. And then it gets worse. The person who borrowed your $900 spends it, and it gets deposited into another bank, which keeps 10% and loans out $810, which gets deposited somewhere else, which loans out $729, and on and on. By the time this chain is finished, your original $1,000 deposit has created about $10,000 in the total money supply. Economists call this the money multiplier effect. I call it the thing that makes me question reality. This is how most money in America is actually created. Not by the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, not by the US Treasury, but by private banks making loans, creating money that didn't exist before. The physical bills? They're just a tiny fraction of the money supply, created mostly to facilitate cash transactions. The real money, the money that drives the economy, is digital, and it's created by debt. Which brings us back to that question from the beginning. If banks can create money out of nothing, why does the government owe $36 trillion? The answer is both simple and absolutely maddening, because the government borrows its own money from itself. When the US government needs money, it doesn't just print it. Instead, the Treasury issues bonds, basically IOUs, which are purchased by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve pays for these bonds by creating money digitally. The government then spends that money into the economy. But the government has to pay back those bonds with interest to whom? To the Federal Reserve, which created the money from nothing in the first place. Read that again slowly. The government borrows money that the Federal Reserve creates from nothing and then pays it back with interest. It's like borrowing $100 from someone who literally invented that $100 in the moment they handed it to you, and then owing them $105. This system has consequences. Big ones. Consequence number 1. Inflation. Every time new money is created, whether through bank loans or Federal Reserve bond purchases, it dilutes the value of existing money. This is why your grandparents could buy a house for $20,000 and you can't buy a used car for that price. The money supply has expanded dramatically, making each dollar worth less. Consequence number 2. Debt spiral. Because the money supply is created through debt, the economy needs constantly increasing debt to function. If everyone tried to pay off all their debts simultaneously, there literally wouldn't be enough money in existence to do it. The system requires perpetual borrowing to survive. Consequence number 3. Control. Whoever controls the creation of money controls everything. This is why in 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt made it illegal for Americans to own gold. Executive Order 6100 to force citizens to turn in their gold to the government at $20.67 per ounce. Then, once the government had collected everyone's gold, they revalued it to $35 per ounce. Instant 70% profit for the government. Instant 70% loss for citizens. Why? Because gold represented money that the government couldn't create or control. By moving America to a pure paper currency system, they ensured that all money could be created, controlled, and manipulated by the central banking system. And before you think this is ancient history, in 1971, President Nixon completely severed the dollar's connection to gold. Since then, the dollar has been what is called fiat currency. Money that has value simply because the government says it does. Which means the dollar bills in your wallet are worth something only because we all agree they are. There's no gold backing them, no commodities. Just collective belief, and honestly, that should terrify you a little bit. The question isn't whether this pattern will repeat with the US dollar. The question is when. Now, you might think this is just how modern economies work. Every country does something similar, right? Sure, but the parallels to historical economic collapses are unsettling. In 1923, Weimar Germany faced hyperinflation so severe that people used wheelbarrows full of cash to buy bread. Why? Because the government was printing money to pay off debts. Sound familiar? In 2008, Zimbabwe's inflation rate reached 89.7 sextillion%. That's 89,700,000,000,000,000,000,000%. A single loaf of bread cost 1.6 trillion Zimbabwean dollars. Why excessive money creation to cover government spending? Venezuela in 2018, inflation over 65,000%. People abandon the national currency entirely. The pattern is always the same. Governments create more money than the economy can support. The currency loses value, prices skyrocket, and eventually, the system collapses. But that can't happen to the US dollar, you say. It's the world reserve currency, and you're right, for now. But here's some data that should make you uncomfortable. The US money supply has increased by over 40% since 2020. The national debt increases by roughly $1 trillion every 100 days. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet has expanded from $800 billion in 2007 to over $8 trillion today. Every major empire in history has eventually debased its currency. Rome did it. The British Empire did it. The pattern is consistent. Currency debasement leads to economic decline, leads to loss of global power. So what do you actually do with this information? Takeaway number 1, understand what money really is. Money isn't wealth, It's a claim on wealth. Physical dollars, despite their elaborate creation process, are just fancy paper that represents a promise. The real value is in what money can buy: goods, services, time, skills. Focus on acquiring things with actual intrinsic value, not just accumulating currency that's being constantly diluted. Takeaway number 2. The system is designed this way. This isn't a bug. It's a feature. The complexity isn't accidental. When systems are difficult to understand, they're easier to manipulate. The fact that most people don't understand how money is created is a failure of education and as a strategic advantage for those who benefit from the current system. Takeaway number 3. You have more power than you think every time you choose what to do with your money, whether to save, spend, invest, or convert it to other assets. You're making a statement about what you believe has value. The system only works because we participate in it. Understanding how it works is the first step to making informed decisions about your participation. So the next time you hold a dollar bill, remember, you're holding a piece of fabric that took 3 weeks to create, costs 7.5 cents to manufacture, and represents a share of a money supply where 89% doesn't physically exist. You're holding a promise from a government that's $36 trillion in debt, created by a private banking system that generates money through the creation of debt, in a process so convoluted that most people never question it. And maybe that's the point. The question I lines leave you with is this: in a world where money can be created from nothing, what actually has value? If this video made you think differently about that dollar bill in your wallet, hit the like button. It helps more people discover this information. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into the systems that shape our world. And drop a comment. Did you know how money was actually created before watching this? What shocked you most? Because the more people who understand how the game is played, the harder it becomes to manipulate. Thanks for watching. Now go question everything.